So welcome everyone to Catholic Mary in Southeast Asia with Professor Deirdre de la Cruz. Our workshop, Biblical Women Across Abrahamic Religions, has been funded by the 4 National Resource Centers and our Title VI grants at the University of Michigan. Professor Deirdre de la Cruz is a historian and cultural anthropologist of the Philippines at the University of Michigan. De la Cruz's first book, Mother Figured, Marian Apparitions and the Making of a Filipino Universal, is a study of the efflorescence of apparitions and miracles of the Virgin Mary in the Philippines from the mid-19th century to the turn of the millennium. Her current book project investigates alternative spiritual and religious movements in the Philippines as they intersect with and influence occult and New Age discourses and practices worldwide. Professor de la Cruz, we're delighted to hear from you today. And yeah, okay, your screen is now shared, so let's begin. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Jessica. It's so fantastic to be here. Happy Teacher Appreciation Week as somebody who just sent her 10-year-old to in-person school for the first time in 14 months. I am incredibly grateful for everything that you guys do. It's also, timely to be talking about the Virgin Mary on Mother's Day weekend for those of you who mark it. So there's just all sorts of timelinesses that surround this presentation of mine. So I was asked to talk about Catholic Mary in Southeast Asia. I'm going to focus primarily in the Philippines. This is my area of research. And also it is the place where, you find the greatest population of self-identified Catholics in Southeast Asia. However, I do hope that some of the things that I'll share will serve as models for thinking in other Southeast Asian contexts and in other Catholic contexts throughout the world. So I'm going to begin. And I also am very interactive. I tend to be very interactive in the classroom. So please, if there's any moment at which you want to stop and ask a question, this is not like a lecture. It's just more, a presentation of some ideas and then some background. So please feel free to interrupt me with questions and I'm happy to take them. So this always happens. I can't always forward. Okay. So I have a little bit of an outline here. This is just mainly, to remind yourself of the presentation afterwards. Of course, this PowerPoint and some of the other resources that I'll share in this presentation will be available to you. I always like to begin with some broad questions, and these are ones that I actually bring into the classroom. I do a lot of teaching on religion and religious traditions, and so I'm always thinking in the back of my mind, how to incorporate religion. Sorry, I also have to move the little sidebar here so I can see. How to incorporate religion as content without necessarily advocating a religious perspective, how to do so in ways too that is respectful of the different knowledge frameworks and belief frameworks that might be in your classroom. How do you read religious texts and actors and objects and practices or events historically and culturally? This is really what underlies, all of my work. And then where it comes to Mary in particular, how does religion and Catholicism especially articulate gender roles and changes in gender roles over time? And I'll be talking a little bit about that today. So just to give you a kind of quick and dirty background in the Philippines for those of you who are not too familiar with the country. So this is the contemporary map of the Philippines as a nation state now. But what I always like to remind people is that, in fact, if you zoom out, it's really an archipelago in this much broader maritime Southeast Asia region, which is to say that it historically has partaken of long, centuries long, in some cases millennia long trade routes from India, from the Middle East, what we think of as now the Middle East, from China, And so it was by no means when the Spanish came, this kind of isolated or, sort of virgin territory, that it was already embedded in multiple kinds of trade networks. It already had a significant Islamic presence. It had some kind of political and cultural influences from India and South Asia, from Hinduism, and it also had the presence of ethnic Chinese migrants and traders who were long conducting trade in this kind of archipelagic region of Southeast Asia. The major events in Philippine history: we are now on the 500th year anniversary of Magellan's landing on the island of Samar, which a lot of Filipinos have taken to celebrate as the 500th anniversary of the evangelization of the Philippines. So there's been all sorts of stuff happening around that. When Magellan comes, he brings his priest and he converts the Datu, and Datu is a term that, for lack of a perfect translation, is often described as kind of a chief, Humabon, and hundreds of his followers. And Magellan, as many of us know, met a not so great fate of being killed in the Philippines by Humabon's rival, Datu Lapu-Lapu. And I'm going to say a little bit more. I'm going to have us do a little bit of an exercise around this. It isn't until 1565 that the first organized expedition to the islands was led by Miguel Lopez de Legazpi under Felipe II, for whom Las Islas Filipinas is named. So those of you who've always wondered where Philippines gets its name, it's actually from Felipe II. And what this means is that, prior to Lopez de Legazpi's organized expedition and the naming of this archipelago, there's no such thing as the Philippines. This is to think about the Philippines as we understand it now, before the 16th century, is anachronistic, and we are better off thinking about it in this, much wider maritime Southeast Asian world that I showed. I'm going to try also to have my chat window up in case. Let's see. So just a couple of other things to note. Really, it was the religious orders that held the most sway in the Philippines. And there's a number of reasons for this. First of all, it just has to do with the sheer distance. There wasn't the kind of colonial governance. There wasn't the kind of conquistadores that we see in South America or in the New World, in New Spain. And really, the religious orders were the ones who were on the ground. And over the course of the 300 plus years that Spain colonized the Philippines, it was the religious orders that really held power, that really held kind of cultural influence. And so conversion to Christianity is, of course, paramount in this history. Currently, almost 90% of all Filipinos self-identify as Christian, and a majority of that 90%, probably about 80 to 90%, identify as Catholic. So it is really uniquely this predominantly Catholic country in Asia, although there are, of course, Catholics in other parts of Southeast Asia, including what's now Vietnam and Indonesia, in Singapore, and so forth. We have in the mid-19th century, what we would think of as kind of the empire striking back, where, after hundreds of years of evangelization and really the making of a kind of Filipino Catholic population, you have a series of popular revolts. Some people would call them millenarian-inspired revolts of Catholics who draw on Catholicism and draw on Christianity as the means to oppose Spanish colonial rule. This reaches all the way into the revolutionary period of the Philippines against Spain. And then, as you all know, sparked by the Spanish-American War, the Philippines comes under US rule and is an American territory, and then Commonwealth until 1946. So that just helps us situate a little bit. I always feel like we can't really understand the importance of Mary until we really think about what is in place before the arrival of Christianity, as it plays such a strong role in how Filipinos have appropriated and really, made Mary local to the context. So here's just some features of pre-colonial Philippines. And again, I put it in inverted commas to indicate that, there's really quite no such thing yet before the Spanish come, but we'll use it as a shorthand nonetheless. So as I mentioned, it's already part of this larger social, geographical, trade, economic, linguistic field of Southeast Asia, of maritime and island Southeast Asia. It is characterized by widespread cognatic kinship, which means that descent is traced through both male and female lines. This doesn't necessarily mean egalitarianism, as it might suggest, but it does mean that women and men have certain parity socially and culturally. It is religiously animist, which is to say that spiritual power is believed to derive from the ancestors and from the natural world. So even to this day, there are parts of the landscape that are considered sacred, that have kind of hybridized with Catholicism, but that are nonetheless, are vestiges of this earlier order of a sacred landscape. So in pre-colonial times, there might be discrete spirits that reside in natural features, whether it be, rivers or mountains or caves, and one would have to propitiate or ask permission or ask pardon in order to move through the landscape. Another important feature of pre-colonial culture is the belief in the power and the presence of one's ancestors that often takes material form in what's known as anitos, little figurines that could be made that aren't necessarily in the shape of a human, but could be, and that could be made from clay, wood, gold, animal teeth, and so forth. In the pre-colonial times, women and transgendered women played key roles. Gender in pre-colonial Southeast Asia is, often considered and celebrated to be much more fluid than what we see then imposed with Christianity. And it was really women or feminized men who were the kind of spiritual brokers for the populations. They were the ones who took care of spiritual needs, but also, sort of worldly needs. They were healers, they were midwives, and they also acted as kind of spirit mediums. One can imagine what then this sets the tone for once that the Spanish come in. But I'll leave that to later. And men tended to hold more kind of political and martial or temporal power as chiefs, as warriors, as different classes of laborers, and so forth. So this is, again, just to help contextualize a little bit what things look like once the Spanish come and they introduce their pantheon of saints and their ideas about, Christianity, monotheism, Jesus, and so forth. Are there any questions so far? I'm happy to take questions as we go along. No? Okay, so I'll give an example. If you look at Spanish missionary sources, as I do a lot in my research, you'll find the figure of what's known as the babaylan or the Catalonan, these different terms depending on which language. The Philippines has not only 7,000 plus islands, but also hundreds of languages that the missionaries learned. But you'll see still the presence of these local terms in missionary texts. And the babaylan and the Catalonan is a figure, one of these sort of priestesses. And here we just have an excerpt from Jesuit Pedro Chirino, one of his early accounts of the Philippines. And it gives you, even as biased as it is, and talking or assuming that what he's seeing or describing is a form of devilry or demonic possession. These early missionary sources, in the absence of other kinds of sources, really do serve a sort of anthropological purpose for showing us at least what some rituals might have been in the pre-colonial period. So there's sacrifice, there's kind of spirit possession, there's different forms of healing that you'll see being represented in the missionary sources. Babaylan is not a cognate of Babylon. Babaylan, I think it's probably related to the Tagalog term babae, which means woman. And it's a good question, but in this case, I think it's actually more related to one of the local Tagalog terms, Filipino terms. So let's talk now about conversion to Christianity. If we were to summarize what conversion strategies were to Christianity, and this is a great place to think comparatively in, to other contexts where you had widespread Catholic Christian conversion that was, attached to colonization. You had, first of all, the attempt to really resettle populations around the church and the plaza. So in the pre-colonial period, communities were largely dispersed and formed different networks. You didn't have the high centralization of the civilization as you would have had in places in New Spain. You don't know, or even in other parts of Southeast Asia. Really, you're talking about, political and social units that are built around kinship or around clan, that are led by these chiefs or datus who have relationships with one another and who are somewhat dispersed. So this was a major obstacle for the missionaries, because they were used to, especially from their experience in the New World, they were used to centralizing their converts in what was known as the Cabecera Visita complex, where they had like the church and like the municipal building around a plaza. And then if they had to, little satellite chapels. So that was the strategy, was to actually relocate people into these more centralized units of administration. The Spanish missionaries, the religious orders, were really the first, not just the first really anthropologists, I think, of the Philippines, but also the first linguists. They spent a lot of effort and time in learning the local languages, in introducing Catholicism via the local vernaculars. Yes, that's right. So it's not always by force. I mean, it's not to say that it wasn't violent. There's certainly symbolic violence, but it is really different from what you see in the early colonial and conquistador period in the New World. And this has to do in part with the time lapse between, the kind of colonization of the New World and the colonization of the Philippines, and some of the intervening debates that happened in that time lapse. So like the famous debates in Valladolid, where there were actually, discussions around like the human nature of the so-called Indio or the native. And so what you have in the Philippine context is not so much colonization and conversion by conquest, but colonization and conversion by what they called pacification. And it's all the more reason why conversion became like the primary means to subjugate the population. But there was violence, and I'll get to where that violence was in a little bit. So they learned the local languages, and they tried to convert people in the local languages, everything from prayers to the sacraments to the mass. There was no Bible then, right? The Catholics didn't convert. They didn't translate the Bible. We don't have Bible translation until much, much later. In the Philippine context, you have the emphasis of ritual over doctrine. So Filipino Catholicism is very kind of performance-based. It's very visual. Some would say it's very kind of spectacle based. It's not about, learning the deep theology of Catholicism. It's not to say that now, there aren't Filipinos interested in theology, but historically, it's really been about the rituals of the Mass and the sacraments and the fiestas and the feast days and that sort of thing. One way that they converted the population was by taking male leadership in the figure of the datu or the chief and giving them a role in the kind of structure of governance. And where the counterpart, leadership, female spiritual leadership was concerned, there's no doubt if you, think about Pedro Chirino's description of the Babaylan, that these female figures of spirituality just had to be eradicated. Not killed per se, but that their importance in the society and in the communities and the importance of their roles, both worldly and spiritual, had to be extirpated, gotten rid of. And there's all sorts of records and primary source material around the attempts to vilify spiritual women. But again, these things never fully can be stamped out, and we see them arguably in the importance of a figure like Mary. In this period, no, there was a form of script. This is a question where the Mass is able to read and write. There was a form of script that's known as the Baybayin, and it's a form of script that I think is based on Jawi or Sanskrit. And what's interesting is that there were actually, literacy rates were actually quite high, but the function of this script was not, to chronicle in the way that we think of, using primary sources like a missionary chronicle would be. So the script might have been used to, for example, draw up contracts, of debtedness or indebtedness. It might have been used for love letters, other sorts of sort of formal, what's other examples I could think of? Maybe sort of ritual purposes, but it wasn't the way we think of a script or text or writing in the European context, where people write letters to each other with accounts, and you have all these chronicles, and you have a whole kind of practice of like writing history, and that didn't exist in that way. And conversion strategies incorporate lessons from Islam and Mindanao or Chinese migrants. I mean, yes and no. So in some ways, the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula was like the wind in the sails of the Philippine evangelical or the evangelizing mission. Those memories of the Reconquista of Spain and Portugal from the Moors was something, that was still very present, I think, for the missionaries. And you can see that in their attitudes towards Muslims, especially where Muslims were concentrated in the southern part of the Philippines. And it's one of the reasons why, it took until the Americans for the southern Philippines to really become fully incorporated into the Philippines, because there was a lot of resistance against the Spanish from the Muslims in Mindanao. And conversion strategies, yes, Chinese migrants, and I'm about to get to that with an example. So they had to replace native sacred objects with Catholic images of saints and Mary, and they often used miracle stories as morality tales, as new ways of introducing logics of cause and effect. Whereas one might imagine, the failure to propitiate a spirit being the cause of one's illness. Now or the propitiation of a good spirit being the cause of one's curing. Now, they could say, well, it's because you had a little prayer card of, Saint Ignatius of Loyola or something that was placed on you, or you prayed or something. All right, so what I wanted to do now is, let me just keep track of time. Time goes by so fast. So one example that I do a lot in my classes when I teach about both the history of the Philippines and the history of Christianity in Asia is I give students an excerpt of Pigafetta, Antonio Pigafetta's chronicle of Magellan's voyage. And I'm going to stop screen sharing right now because I'm going to put in the chat a brief excerpt. And this is only, oops, sorry, I think I put it just to Rima, hold on. And what I thought I would ask folks to do is go into breakout rooms. This is only like 2 or 3 pages long. And just to give you some context. So, Magellan arrived in Samar. The first person of political leadership that he encountered was this Datu named Humabon. Humabon had a lot of followers. And if you read Magellan's account or Pigafetta's account, Magellan's chronicler, if you read Pigafetta's account, it would seem that Humabon just embraced the whole thing, just, was totally, ready to make himself a subject of the crown of Spain and to convert to Christianity. What we know is that actually Humabon was a rival of this other Datu Lapu-Lapu. And so you can imagine maybe a different story happening. So what I'd like to do is have folks go into breakout rooms. Let me just put this up again as some prompts to think about. So what I'm giving you is a brief excerpt of the account of the baptism of Humabon, and importantly, his wife and his followers. And what I would ask is just saying, what is described in the scene? What are some of the biases that you detect? I love using primary sources to teach with, because especially missionary sources, their perspective is so patently one-sided that it actually is really encouraging of kind of critical reading and critical thinking. And then to see if you can come up with a kind of alternative version or, alternative explanation or descriptions of what's happening. Okay, so you have that. Can I have folks go, if first of all, you to download the PDF, hopefully it shouldn't take long. And I put a little highlight where you want to start. And even if you just get through that first, those first 2 pages, that will be plenty, I think, to talk about.
And I'm going to open the rooms right now. So you should all be assigned a room now.
Great. And I'll maybe give like 10 minutes or so, 5 to 8 minutes. I'm muted. Okay.
Great. Rima, are you there?
Oh, there's people having a hard time opening the PDF. So let me just put it, I'll put it back there.
I'm hoping that they I suppose, do people in breakout rooms, can they share their screens with one another? Probably not, right?
I am not sure about that level.
They would have to probably all be made co-hosts, or Multiple participants, all participants.
Yeah, I think maybe we should refrain from assigning co-host privileges to everyone. I think it might be a tangle later when they come back in, Deirdre.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, the other thing I could do is, if the breakout rooms don't work, we can just call everybody back and I'll put it on my screen.
I think
That makes
people
sense.
they're in the rooms and
They have it.
I'm sure there'll be conversation.
That's always the weird thing is people go into breakout rooms and you don't really know what's happening after that.
So I have confidence that some people can open it and then they can have a larger conversation, even if they can't all see the document.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
But it's fascinating. It's such a fantastic subject and presentation, Deirdre. Thank you so much.
Oh,
Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, and even if they don't get through the whole conversation or the whole document, it's just an example of the kind of thing that they could do. I mean, I love, like I said, teaching with primary sources, and students always get a lot out of unpacking these missionary sources. And, to have like, not just any missionary, but to have like a chronicle of Magellan showing up in this primal scene of, the first baptism and picking apart what else could be going on, I just find really useful. So I'll also put this in the resources folder.
Yes, thank you. You didn't get a chance to see it, Deirdre, of course, but we are commissioning the design of a lesson plan we'll be sharing. And in the lesson plan, there's some real attention to Catholic Mary in the Philippines and Southeast Asia more generally.
Oh, great. Great.
Yeah.
Great.
It's exciting. We're working with the Center for Education Design, Evaluation and Research, CEDAR, at the School of Education, and they do such a great job helping us develop toolkits and like how to integrate this sort of content into a high school or middle school classroom.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I've become so much more interested in this now. I mean, part of it has been the pandemic and, not being able to travel and do research. So really coming back to like a dig where you are.
Yeah.
Strategy, which means I've been doing a lot thinking about the archives here and about, US imperialism in the Philippines, because Michigan was like a center for producing knowledge about the Philippines. And just thinking a lot about how to integrate it into teaching secondary school, right? So, what's good is that with the archival stuff, I mean, most of it isn't English, so you can really use it to teach about empire in ways that I think is really fruitful. And it's very local. It's also very local history because a lot of the American colonial administrators were from Michigan or from the U of M.
Yeah.
So yeah, let me know. Yeah. I mean, if you guys need material, especially from the US period.
That's a great.
I just don't think people realize like the University of Michigan's role in the state of Michigan and the collection, the connection to the Philippines, right?
Yeah. No, they don't know.
Students coming over from the Philippines, at the University of Michigan.
Right. And students coming here don't know. I mean, if I had my way, students every undergraduate who came would get a crash course, like a mini course in the history of the university that would include the university's role in US empire.
Yeah.
That's sort of my little dream.
Yeah.
For all of LS&A. Anyway.
It's a wonderful suggestion, Deirdre. I think also it forces us to quite literally in more ways than that to ground ourselves.
Yeah.
The local.
Right.
Yeah.
To realize that the role that Michigan has had in the world, even as it is in some ways a very local history.
I'm sure Chow Ren. And
yeah, of course.
Yeah. And so he just told me how he found letters at the Clements Library from Americans going over to the Burma oil fields.
Oh my gosh.
And describing, Buddhist rituals in the community and what it was like living in Burma at that time. And he had no idea that our library would contain such letters. It was like a person from Virginia.
Well, so here's the weird thing is that the Clements, is one of these libraries that I was always like, okay, that place doesn't have Philippine materials. Almost every other collection on campus does, but the Clements, because that's whatever, some other kind of Americana. But we just heard from, I'm part of this working group to think about decolonial and reparative approaches to the collections. And we just heard from the director of the Clements saying, yeah, we actually have a ton of Philippine stuff. It's just never been cataloged.
Wow, that's a big deal.
It's a huge deal. So anyway, this is a conversation for another time. Maybe we should bring people back.
Yes. All right. They're on their way back.
Okay, great.
That would make a really great Title VI project, Deirdre.
Well, you know what? So we're doing something with the Humanities Collaboratory. We did like a 5x5, and then we got a project development grant, which we're currently doing because we're going to apply to the big 2-year, $500,000 grant to do this decolonize the archives project. So if there are, I will be reaching out to the center for sure, because we'll want to, as we put together the much bigger proposal, we'll want to know what other institutional partners there are that we can, work with and collaborate with and contribute to and so forth.
Let's definitely talk. So it looks like people are here. They're coming back.
Coming in.
All right.
Okay. All right. Let me go back to screen sharing. So is everybody back? Okay. So why don't we just take a couple of examples of what, and I know that it's kind of a lot, there probably wasn't enough time to read the full excerpt, but hopefully that just gave you a sense of a kind of an idea for something that you could do that involves religion and conversion and colonization and Mary. So what are some things that you came up? Oh, you couldn't open it. I am so sorry. Screen shared. Okay. Okay. So let me, hold on. Let me go ahead and screen share it very quickly. And, this will be available. I will give you the even longer excerpt that I use in the classroom, but I use this to teach about the early conversion in the Philippines. And I would give students some of the information that I shared with you about what existed in pre-colonial times, the role of women, the role of these sort of anitos, as well as some of the political context of the rivalries between chiefs and so on and so forth. So what's really great about this is that it tells this really kind of romanticized story of the first baptism with Humabon, and then the baptism of Humabon's wife and Humabon's followers. And again, if you read this from Magellan's perspective, or from Pigafetta speaking from Magellan's perspective, you'll see that it's largely a smooth process. And then what I like to do, yes, right. So let's hear a little bit from other people. So Olivia Wiley says, Arthur depicts the early conversion as such a willing situation on part of the natives. I'm filled with foreboding when the king mentions gold. Exactly. So one of the things that you could do is, have students work on a brief excerpt like this with some of the background or some of the context, and then have them identify places in the text where they too might be filled with foreboding, right? Or where they too are kind of like, I find that a little bit hard to believe. So for example, when we see that the queen And again, notice too, like the language here and how, the missionaries and Magellan, the priests and Magellan, they're understanding the local world in entirely sort of Eurocentric terms, right? So Humabon, who is a different kind of political leader, is called a king. His wife is called a queen. Right, so that like the burning of the idols and the Spaniards' reaction, that they're doing this so willingly, right? That that the queen is like so tickled by this image. If you know even just a little bit about the existence of like figurines that represent the ancestors, that represent the spirits, then you could conceivably you could better understand this apparent willingness to embrace these Christian icons, right? Because they could be seen from the so-called queen's perspective as being of a kind with the idols that she would have already been, a part of her spiritual life. Another bias is that, yeah, exactly. Catholic statues are exactly. How will my students react to the burning of the village of the heathens who chose not to be converted? Yeah, exactly. So even if it's sort of romanticized, you still have these descriptions of violence. And what's shocking about them is how nonchalant that they appear to be in the chronicle, right? So who are the other group who they didn't burn? The other group that they didn't burn was probably those who had ostensibly converted. Exactly. And you see this huge bias against Moros. This is what I was saying in response to another question, is that, the Spanish missionaries and those who colonized the Philippines had very much the memory of the kind of Christian Muslim conflicts and the so-called taking back of the peninsula in their is kind of part of the ethos of their mission. Exactly, you have all kinds of gendered observations that you can make. Right, so you can see just how productive this could be, even if you didn't really get a chance to read the full excerpt. So you can imagine, having the students either work in small groups or taking the excerpt home, and then, being able to talk about it later. So let me move on, because there's a couple of other examples of the kinds of things that you could do where Mary is concerned in particular. Why Mary? This is a pretty straightforward one. She really is one of the most important, if not, if you ask some people, the most important Catholic figure for Filipinos. This is what I was saying as people were filing into this presentation. Mary is so productive because she can represent and symbolize all kinds of different meanings, cultural attributes. And as I'm about to give you an example of, Mary in her very local forms can be a kind of archive that you can mine for actual historical events. So I want to give you another example of that. Yes, absolutely. And this is definitely the case with Mary in Mexico. So I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. This is one example, but it's more to give you a model of how to think about like a miracle tale, or in this case, an apparitional tale. This is the image and the apparition story of Our Lady of Kaysasay from the early 17th century. And the basic story is a template that is really common across the early modern Catholic world. There's a native villager, and he's doing his everyday stuff, fishing, and he pulls out of the lake this delightful little image, which he takes to be a sign, and really in and of itself a kind of appearance, a miraculous appearance of Mary. He brings the image to the village priest, who sees in it an opportunity, right, to kind of further edify and like convert the population, to foster devotion to Mary. And so the local priest or the local friar takes the image, tries to, give it a place in the center. Remember, we talked about the resettlement of native populations. Give it a place in the center. Lo and behold, though, every morning when the villagers wake up, the image has disappeared, and they find it always back near the spot where she was found in the first place. So there's a lot of elements here that you can read as a kind of broader story of early conversion, right? Making the indigenous people is sort of the center of the story. Those of you who are familiar with the story of the Our Lady of Guadalupe, we know the famous Juan Diego is, just your average kind of guy. It's always like the ordinary people that encounter these things. And then you have the ecclesiastical authorities, or, that's represented in the priest, who tries to domesticate the story or domesticate the image. Finds that there's still this recalcitrance, there's this resistance to being really kept in the official sacred center of the village, and this resistance is exercised by Mary herself. And so finally the priest is like, okay, well, let's just put a satellite chapel there, because that's where she wants to be, and we'll administer it. And there's kind of like the negotiation that happens between indigenous peoples and the church in this early conversion period, right? And absolutely, miracles were used to convert people all the time. I want to tell you a little bit of a miracle story too, that I've used to think about some real specific things in the Philippines. So I mentioned that, prior to the arrival of any Europeans in the archipelago, the islands were already embedded in these networks of trade that included Chinese trade. And so there had long been the presence of Chinese migrants, as well as Chinese sojourners. The Chinese were very, very vexing for the Spanish. On the one hand, they wanted the Philippines as a launching point to try to convert in China. On the other hand, they needed the Chinese because the Chinese served really important kind of intermediary roles where trade was concerned. So economically, they relied on the Chinese. But on a third hand, they had these very, kind of basically racist ideas about the Chinese, and were really suspicious of the capacity of the Chinese to truly convert, right, to Christianity. So there were massacres of Chinese in the 17th century by Spain, and sometimes upwards of thousands in, at a time when, Chinese populations in the early 17th century in the Philippines would have been, at the, 10, maybe at the most, maybe 20, 30,000. So the massacre, the full-scale massacre of Chinese. What's fascinating about this miracle tale is that there's a part of the story that involves a Chinese named Huan Imbin, who sometimes gets rendered as Hai Bing. And he's a stonemason, and he helps build the chapel that is, set up for Our Lady. But he's the victim of one of these pogroms, one of these massacres of Chinese. But he receives a miracle because he's brought back to life, right? And we could see how this is a story that not only gives us a lot of historical specificity about the Philippines at this time, where the Chinese population is concerned and where antagonism between the Spanish and the Chinese are concerned, but it's also this morality tale that the missionaries, kind of drew on in order to make an example of this Chinese stonemason. The story ends, again, very unfortunately. So after this, Chinese Huan Imbin is basically saved by Mary. He's come back to life. he, according to the tale, has this newfound devotion, but then he kind of lapses in this devotion. And one day when he should be at mass, he's preparing his fields, and he gets gored by a carabao or a water buffalo. I mean, really kind of what's the word? Kind of grotesque endings, but it goes to show that, these early periods of mission and conversion, even if we're not talking the level of genocidal violence that we see in the so-called New World, there's still different forms of violence that are at play in attempting to convert people. Yes, in some ways, it's about the historical use of Catholicism to conquer indigenous lands. Yes, under the banner of church and trade. Yes, and I mean, it's a complicated question that presumes that I think Catholicism is only ever a sort of what's the word I'm looking for? That it's only ever a kind of economically motivated thing, or like conversion is only an economically motivated thing. And on one hand, yes, that's absolutely true. On the other hand, there's no doubt that when you read someone like Pedro Chirino and you read some of these missionary sources, they were true believers in their mission, and so became a lot of Filipinos, right? And so, yes, I mean, in the one hand, you can think about, you certainly want to draw out the historical relationship between conversion to Christianity and colonialism, which is really, really key. On the other hand, you miss a lot of what's happening culturally, I think, if it's kind of reduced to being this sort of political and economic thing. You also miss ways that local people creatively adapt Christianity to their own religious belief systems that are not necessarily motivated by these more kind of worldly concerns and questions. Catholic religious orders were most active in the Spanish colonial area. Yes, it is a pilgrimage site today, Our Lady of Kaysay. Augustinians were the first, Franciscans, Dominicans, Jesuits. There were women religious. So Mother Jeronima de Asunción was, I believe, a Franciscan nun. She was dispatched to establish the first nunnery in the Philippines. So yes, I mean, predominantly we're talking about male religious. Okay, so we have just a couple more. These are just some key terms and concepts that I use to think through how over time, Filipinos really adapt Christianity and make it into its own distinct form of Catholicism. Oh, and just what I was going to say here is I have a couple of resources, including one great article by a historian named Christina Lee, who looks very closely at the testimony of this Chinese stonemason. So that's something that you could draw from if you wanted to learn more about that. But my point really is not that that this is like the Our Lady of Kaysay should be like in the curricula, but that it's a great way, if you think about these miracle tales or these apparition stories where you encounter them, you can really pick them apart as archives for history. And this is a final thing I want to bring up, and just start by asking you guys to make some observations about what you see. So these are Filipino religious images. They're called rebulto or saints. And yes, Mary is used differently by the Catholic orders to convert natives. Some of the orders are known as being especially Marian and have really particular devotions to Mary. So the Dominicans in particular are known to be special devotees to Mary through their use of the rosary. And each religious order has its own flavor, right? I mean, each one has its own emphasis, its own charism, its own uniform. And not all emphasize Mary as strongly as others. So it is interesting if you were to map, I've never seen a map like this, but the religious orders did a sort of divide and conquer strategy where one religious order would take a certain region that was mainly defined by language, right? Because they learned the languages, it was a very efficient way to kind of spread out along the islands. But you'll note that there are some regions, even to this day, that have a greater concentration of Marian shrines than others. And that speaks to the kind of emphasis on Mary with some religious orders than other ones. I mean, they all believe in, the Mary and the dogmas of Mary, but they devotionally, and where popular religion is concerned, they emphasize her differently. So let's wrap up here with some observations just of these images. What are some of the things that you see here? What are some of the things that you notice about them? You have the Divine Shepherd from the 17th century. You have then, of course, the famous Virgin of Guadalupe in the 18th century is when it was carved. These would be called Filipino religious images. Right, so there's whiteness, they're both standing on people. There's a kind of whiteness is emphasized. That's certainly true with almost all of the iconography of Mary in the Philippines. She really does look like she comes from somewhere else, and that there's a lot that can be said about that. Is part of her spiritual power that she comes from afar. At the same time, I think as I tried to suggest earlier, a lot of her importance and spiritual power can be seen traced back to the role of women in pre-colonial times and their importance spiritually. They're European looking, okay? Does anyone else have any? A Buddhist influence, absolutely. So what's really interesting is that the Divine Shepherd is actually an image that was carved in, yes, these are all ivory, exactly. So that's part of their whiteness, is that they're made out of ivory. The Divino Pastor is an image that actually is believed to have been carved in India, but that made it to the Philippines. And of course, the Virgin of Guadalupe is a famous Mexican virgin, but was carved in the Philippines. Made in Mexico, right, made in Mexico to look like the native people. It's also arguable that they are made to look more like kind of with, Asian features, right? And there's a lot that you can do with these sorts of images to teach about global trade. So these and many, many, many other images, a lot of them carved in the Philippines, predominantly by Chinese craftsmen, because one of the things that Chinese Filipinos or Chinese in the Philippines were known for was for their craftsmanship, for carving in particular. And so in one image, you can pick apart one image and see these really different sorts of Asian influences, both from Buddhism, in the sort of features, where the ivory is concerned, but still representing these holy icons from elsewhere, Mexico and so forth. And what this partly comes out of is, I'm just doing that because I want to share one more thing, is the Manila galleon trade, which is how I use these images, is to teach about the galleon trade, which went from 1565 to 1815, and that really circulated silver from the New World into Asia, and Asian porcelain, silks, spices from both island, Southeast Asia, and China, that kind of moved through the Philippines. So it was Manila, Acapulco, depending on where you're, Manila, Acapulco, and then the goods would travel over land and then make their way to Spain. So it was this really important part of Spanish colonialism in the region. It was one of the motivations for it, but it results in all of these really incredible cultural artifacts. So this is another link that I will put in the thing, and it just is another thing that you can use. And I realize we're already out of time. So yeah, so they were used to represent to Filipinos an example of Spain's. I'm not really sure. Yes, there could be African influence. I'm not sure if the divine shepherd would be used to represent to them. I mean, I think that the average Filipino Catholic, you know, regards these as tools through which to venerate these different saints and the Virgin Mary. There's always the question of, you know, I mean, like the Orthodox Catholic question was, you know, does this sort of verge on idolatry? Are people understanding the images themselves to be kind of sacred and holy, or, you know, the presence of Mary in the image? That's always an anxiety where Orthodox Catholicism is concerned. But by and large, you know, I mean, these images are just ubiquitous in the Philippines, not the ivory ones per se, but images of Mary and the saints and so forth. And so hopefully this has given you some stuff to think with, some resources and some lessons to model things off of. Sorry, that was really fast at the end.
Let's take some time to thank Professor Deirdre de la Cruz for this amazing presentation. Thank you for, you know, taking time out of your, I'm sure, a busy Saturday morning. That was a fantastic presentation. And we'll make sure to share all of your links and resources and the primary source text with everybody afterwards. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for all you do. Bye.
And for everyone else, we're going to be taking a lunch break and we will resume at 1 p.m. And so let's take time to stretch, eat, and we'll see you at 1 p.m. for our next presentation focused on African diaspora religions in Latin America. Thank you so much.